guztioi. Sailburua, emakunderen zuzendari eta idazkari nagusia. Herri ordezkario, bertatu zareten lagun guztiok, esan bezala, ongi etorri.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome to this event organized by Emakunde called A New Law to Continue Progressing in Equality. This is an event that has been organized by Emakunde, and 1 year ago, on the 3rd of March of 2022, the Basque government passed the reform of the law on equality, complementing the equality law that was passed in 2005. This is an initiative that received the contributions of more than 400 public entities coming from civil society. And this is the basis of this country agreement for equality presented by our regional president last June. But of course, we have to specifically read on this in a moment where there have been a mainstreaming of messages contrary to equality. We are hearing these kind of messages in an organized way. The index of equality, of European equality, shows that the Basque Country is in the 8th position within the European Union. And this law that was passed 1 year ago by the regional government, the Basque regional government, will continue its path on a solid basis or ground. We will talk about the significance of a legal framework to be able to improve some aspects, such as the mainstreaming of equality, the empowerment of women, to help build a society where we can share different values, the involvement of men in equality, education as the really a tool to get that, and of course, lives free from gender violence. We are talking about improving the lives of everyone, and this is a challenge for the whole society in order to get a better society. To continue with this event, we have the Regional Minister of Equality of the Basque Government. So you've got the floor. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. In the Basque Country, 1 year ago, we passed this new law in order to continue progressing in equality. And this is what we want to celebrate today, because its goal is to update and complement that law that was passed in 2005, which was already a very important moment. So today, we want to highlight the significance of this new law, because the purpose is not to be reflected on a paper, but the purpose of any law, of any act, is to have an impact on the lives of women and men. This update will let us continue progressing in different fields. For example, we will be able to continue working on training all staff, administrative staff, so that they have an intersectional perspective in the reparation of women who have been the victims of gender violence, to protect children from gender violence. This will also help us to be able to distribute in an equal way the caring activities, also the involvement of men in these caring activities that have traditionally been carried out by women. And we understand that this event is an act to celebrate all the activities we have before us with this law. We would like to open our perspective towards Europe to know how the European context is. And today we'll be able to listen to different interventions talking about the most basic aspects of this law, these equality laws at a European level. We would like to remember the significance of law to progress in equality. So as I was saying, this is going to be an event to celebrate the anniversary of the law. And we want to go more in depth in our law. And we also want to know the European context of the equality law. So we are going to know different European experiences regarding equality laws in Europe. I'd like to thank especially the participation of expert people today who are going to talk about these experiences. And I would also like to thank the people, associations, and political parties that were involved in this policy, the approval of this policy. In 2 days, we will celebrate the first anniversary of the approval of this law. And today, I'd like to remind you that this is a law that was built on solid grounds. The grounds of the previous law were already an important benchmark for equality in the Basque Country. This law allowed us to continue progressing in equality law and the integration of the gender perspective in health, education, employment, social services, security, and so on. So this has had an impact on all the policies impacting the lives of women and men. We have a new law that we will continue developing in from different points of view. This is going to be a reinforcement of the efforts. This is going to be a progress in equality for the administration staff. We will also improve the protection of children. We will also continue focusing on the prevention, and there will also be a recognition to the right of victims to be repaired. We will also improve in the coordination systems, and we will also allow for a better empowerment of women and the involvement of men. This country, the Basque Country, has a commitment with equality. We want to build a society which is free of violence against women, and we have the social and political context to do so. But we need to continue progressing, and this law is a very important tool to continue working on that, because despite the progress that has been made, the challenges are still ahead. We've got today a tool to face these challenges, and we have a law to continue progressing. So thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much, Regional Minister. We are going to start now with the presentations. Well, if we take a look at the agenda, we have some modifications because the first speaker, María Eugenia Rodríguez Palop, won't be able to be with us today here in person. So we've asked her to send us a video clip where she's summarizing her intervention, and she's also going to tell us which the lines of the work of the European Parliament is on equality between women and men. But before we play the video clip, I would like to introduce you to this MEP. So she's a jurist and researcher and columnist, feminist activist, environmentalist, and a specialist in human rights. She's a lecturer in philosophy of law at the Carlos III University of Madrid. She's currently an MEP heading the list of Unidas Podemos in the European Parliament, and she's also vice chair of the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality. She's published several books, including Revolución Feminista y Políticas de lo Común frente a la extrema derecha, and she continues writing on social movements, common goods, republicanism, feminism, and women's rights. So we are going to listen to her intervention in a video clip regarding the main initiatives by the European Parliament. So my name is Eugenia Rodríguez Palop. I work at the European Parliament, and I am also part of the Committee on Agriculture and Rural Development. I would like to apologize first because I'm not going to be with you today, but I'm going to try to summarize what the equality policies have been in this legislature and the things we have to continue developing. We've always been working against violence against women. We haven't ratified the Istanbul Pact yet at the European Union, but we haven't ratified it because there are 6 governments that haven't allowed us to ratify this agreement. I'm talking about Hungary, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Czech Republic, and so on. Poland threatened to leave this agreement. Well, but we think that even if they've got a right-wing government, we hope that they will finally ratify this agreement. In order to solve these questions, we've tried from the Parliament to consider gender violence a Eurocrime because it has a transborder dimension. It is very serious and we need common criteria. There are only 2 countries within the European Union which have specific policies on gender violence, one of them being Spain. So we really needed a common regulation, a common law. And we had to prosecute criminals all over Europe. So even if this is something that we had to do, we haven't been able to do that yet. And the third essay would be to launch a directive of violence against women and domestic violence. It is called like that because this is how it is called in the Istanbul Agreement. And the purpose is to fight against sexual violence against women and girls. And we are also going to fight sexual violence in general and cyber violence. So the horizon is rather narrow. We wanted it to be broader, but we are now going to tackle the trafficking of women. And one of the things we want to work on this year is the reform of the trafficking directive. We know this directive that already exists is obsolete and it hasn't been applied in all European countries. So one of the big problems of the feminist fight is to avoid discrimination, especially in the employment field. We've made some progress in our pay gap policy in order to solve this problem, and because it means that there is a pay gap of 33% when women are older. So our grandmothers are much poorer because they've used a big part of their lives taking care of people. This directive wants to force companies to publish the wages of their workers to see if there's a pay gap and in order to act against it. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to apply it to big companies. So we know that the impact of this directive is not going to be as big as it could be because our decree in Spain is much broader. But of course, this is a progress in the social pillar of the European Union because this is also, well, we've also have a directive on the minimum wage, and this is especially impacting women because we are 55% of the people who receive the minimum wage. So we hope that this is going to improve the quality of life of many women in the European Union. We also have a reconciliation directive, which is not as stringent as it is in Spain, for example, establishing compulsory maternity leaves, but this is an advance, a progress to reach co-responsibility of men and women in children care. Women are usually in charge of housework. There are 7.7 million women that left the employment market to take care of their families. And there is around 8.9 million women having a partial employment agreement. So it is obvious that the housework and the caring activities have a big impact on the professional development of women. The women that left the employment market, the labor market, to take care of their families are really losing a lot of money. They're much poorer because they care. And in the formal part of the care assistance, these positions are occupied by women, and we know that their wages are lower, and this is not only happening in this specific sector, but their working time is partial, and their situation is much worse. So this is why we've launched a European strategy on care services for dependent people. We know that this care is going to be required for everybody. And we are also focusing on the child care because children aged between 0 to 3 need to be cared of. And those between 0 and 6 years old need to have access to nursery schools or primary schools. Many of them didn't have the possibility to have breakfast or have lunch during the pandemic because they couldn't go to school. So there are many women in a clear situation of poverty. And there are also children in this situation. And our strategy is going to be targeted to these children and women, and also migrant women, because we know that 75% of houses receiving care, they would be poor if they didn't receive any assistance. And this assistance has to be free and public. Finally, of course, there are other peoples I could talk about. This year, we've been able to deactivate the blockade that The directive on women was suffering at the European Council since 2012. There are very few people having representative positions in European companies, especially in listed companies, and this is important because we need to have the possibility to make decisions where decisions have a big significance in economy and companies. So we have to break the glass ceilings, and these ceilings come when from an external instance, we are not allowed to continue professionally developing. And the cement ceilings come when we ourselves, women, put aside to avoid that a successful career won't allow us to continue with our private obligations. So we have to break both ceilings, and this is where we are working now in the committees of employment and women especially, but not only. There are many other possibilities. We have a mainstream view. The gender perspective is mainstream. And also from the Committee on Agriculture, we are also working on the question of women. The women leadership is essential to face all the transformations we need right now and to continue to pursue a much better world. So thank you so much, and I hope to be able to be with you later in a different event. Thank you so much.
So, we also hope that she can come next time. Thank you, MV, for the video you sent. In the European institutions, we've seen what's happening in detail from her side. And again, she excused herself for not being able to attend today. We're now facing the second talk of the day with a European legal framework and European equality laws. Our second presentation by Mrs. Linda Senden, it will be online in English. So a video conference in English because she's in Utrecht in Holland, and we invite people who do not understand English to use the simultaneous translation system. Once you insert the headset, the little gadget will turn on. The first channel will be for Spanish, second for Basque, and third for English. So please choose the language you want to hear her speech in. We say good morning now to Linda Senden. Goedemorgen, Linda. I don't know if we can hear her. Maybe your mic is not on, Linda. We cannot hear you properly.
Yeah, could you switch on the microphone, please, Linda? Maybe the microphone is
I switched
off.
on the microphone. You should be able to hear me now.
Now we can listen to you. Okay, perfect. So,
yeah,
welcome. I'm very pleased to meet you. First of all, let me introduce you to the audience, Linda, and then we will start. Okay?
Yes.
Linda Senden is a professor at the University of Utrecht and member of the European Network of Experts on Equality and Non-Discrimination. She studied international law, European studies, and Dutch law at the University of Amsterdam. She obtained her doctorate degree in law in 2003 at Tilburg University for her thesis on soft law in European community law. In her research, she focuses on the institutional and constitutional dimension of EU law, with a specific interest in regulatory and enforcement aspects of the European integration process in its interaction with the national legal orders. Beraz, Linda Senden entzungo dugu, ordu orden inguruz entzungo dugu bera, eta ondoren galderentzako tarte bat ere irekiko dugu. Un cuarto de hora para escuchar la ponencia de Linda Senden y luego 5 minutos para las posibles
we will
preguntas que
now
puedan
listen
surgir
to
en
her
la sala. Linda, I'm back with
presentation.
you. We are looking forward for listening to your presentation.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. And I'm really sorry I could not be there in person as I would have liked to, but I'm also happy to be able to do this presentation online and saying, well, it's a bit of a challenge to discuss the EU gender equality law approach and its implementation in the member states in 20 minutes. So I want to really do a tour d'horizon, as they say in French, and highlight some important elements, especially also from the experience I have from being involved now as a coordinator in the European Equality Law Network and specifically the gender stream. So we have a great view within that network on how EU law is being implemented, not only in the member states, but actually 36 states, so also other states in Europe, including candidate states. So I want to talk today about the potential and pitfalls in practice. So what can EU law actually offer in this field? What has it offered to the member states of the EU, but also what are really important problems? So if you could move to the next slide, please. So the problems are still manifold, of course, in Europe, despite having decades of gender equality law. We see, of course, our member of a number of issues, but we can say generally in the employment sphere, in the market sphere, in the public sphere, we see still very problematic issues, women earning less, having problems in having a good work-life balance. Equal pay is still a major problem, but financial independence more generally. But we have also, let's say, newer problems when it comes to, for instance, algorithmic discrimination, and also, for instance, in the area of health. And so the problems are manifold, but what does EU law has to offer? So if you can move to the next slide, please. We need to go back a bit to the origins of EU gender equality law. And everything stems, you could say, basically from an internal market approach, nationality discrimination being an important factor, let's say, to make or combating nationality discrimination in between the member states of the EU is the basis for the functioning of the internal market. And that's how gender equality came into the picture in the EEC in the first place, in its Article 119 of the EEC Treaty, stipulating the rule for equal pay for men and women, but not because of a social concern, but only an economic concern to prevent social dumping, France claiming that it already ensured equal pay for men and women and being afraid other countries did not. So next slide, please. So, I don't know. I'm not sure what happened here to my slide. I'm sorry, but this is actually to refer to the first important case that came to the Court of Justice, which was brought by an air hostess in Belgium because she was being dismissed at the age of 40, whereas men could stay on working as stewards, and she claimed that also impacted on her equal pay and social security, pensions, entitlement. And actually 3 cases she brought to court, 3 cases ended up before the European Court of Justice to really stipulate, or let's say to find out what meaning to give to Article 119 of the EEC Treaty. And very importantly, what you cannot see now on the slide is, but what the court said, well, there is also a social dimension to this provision. So not just an economic concern. It actually recognized that individuals could rely on this provision in the national court to claim a right of equal pay, and not just against public authorities, but also in private relationships. So imposing a duty also on social partners and, for instance, private employers. And importantly, the court also recognized its fundamental rights status and its recognition as a general principle of EU law. So that has been key in making, let's say, in really generating the body of gender equality law later on. So if you can move to the next slide, please. Because we can see, from the Fren, which was ruled in 1970, the first case, we see that ever since equal treatment between men and women has become recognized as a common value in the current EU treaty. It's part of the goals of the EU to protect the core values of the EU, so including equal treatment between men and women. There is the important provision in the treaty on the functioning of the European Union on mainstreaming, so it has to be taken on board in all of the activities of the European Union in all policy fields. Ever since the Treaty of Lisbon came into force in 2009, there are also the binding provisions 21, 23, and 33 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which importantly protect or stipulate a principle that goes beyond the sphere of work. So this has a more general meaning. It includes positive action and also reconciliation of family life and work life. And also Article 19 was added to the functioning treaty by one of the treaty amendments, so as to stipulate a legal basis for legislation also on other grounds of discrimination. So we see a huge development ever since this original Article 119 of the EEC Treaty. And this provision itself was also extended through time to enable more legislation to be adopted on this basis. So next slide. So what can we see then on the legislative level? There has been an enormous important dynamic, you could say, between individuals bringing cases to national courts referring cases to the European Court of Justice for obtaining a preliminary ruling on the correct interpretation of the EU, the applicable EU law. And we see that such case law has also been codified to a certain extent in different council and later on also European Parliament directives on different topics within the field of gender equality law. So starting with equal pay, later in 1976, extending it to access to employment, vocational training, promotion and working conditions, occupational social security systems in 1986. And also an important directive was established in 1997 on the shift of the burden of proof in cases of discrimination. So trying to make it easier for individuals to bring a case to court and to plead discrimination. So in 2006, these different directives were merged, so to speak, or recasted in Directive 2006/54, which became known as the recast directive. But really relating very much to the employment sphere. So next slide, please. And we see, on the other hand, also statutory social security, an important domain of regulation, safety and health at work of pregnant workers, but then also an important directive adopted in 2004, trying to generate more equal treatment in the market sphere, so access to and supply of goods and services, self-employed directive, and also most recently 2019 Work-Life Balance Directive, which had its deadline for transposition in August of last year. Next slide, please. So we see in this body of EU gender equality law a combination of negative obligations, so prohibitions to discriminate in specific fields, but also positive obligations to promote equality more actively, so by allowing for positive action, by focusing on a better work-life balance and measures to support that, protection of pregnancy and maternity, and also the Gender Balanced Company Boards Directive that was just also alluded to already. I think it must be noted, though, that there is an important limitation to what the EU can do, because it can only act within the scope of EU powers that have been allocated to it. So that means that it's much more difficult for the EU to legislate, for instance, in the area of health protection, because EU powers there are much more limited than in other fields of EU law. Next slide, please. So if you talk about key achievements in this field, well, we can say it's because of the scope the non-discrimination principle has gained. And the court has played an important role in not only saying, well, that the prohibition of discrimination concerns direct forms of discrimination, but also indirect discrimination. It includes a prohibition of sexual harassment, also protection against victimization. And importantly so, this is coupled, you could say, with the development of an individual rights-based approach. So based on, national courts, where individuals can go to directly, also rely directly, at least under certain conditions, on EU equality law, and of course, national implementing law, but also the court stipulating specific requirements for effective judicial protection and for this shift of the burden of proof. So these are major achievements. Next slide, please. I think I need to speed up a little bit in view of time. Can you please move to the next slide? Yes, thank you. So perhaps I'll skip this one because I take it that the notion of indirect discrimination is known to many of you already. So for the sake of time, can you please move forward? Can you move to the next slide, please? Yeah. So I think what is important is also to consider, well, what kind of concept does underlie the EU law approach. So if you take here what the recast directive says on positive action, then we see, well, the wording that is used now is to ensure full equality in practice. But what does that actually mean? So what is the normative aim of EU gender equality law? So next slide, please. So here we can think, well, of a formal approach, equal opportunities approach, a substantive approach that would be focused more on obtaining equality of results rather than just having a leveling of the playing field. But if you would say, well, EU law or gender equality law more in general should be transformative, then it would mean also that it really tackles underlying gender stereotypes. So if we see the CEDAW approach, in the next slide, please. In the CEDAW approach, there is a transformative element to the gender equality law approach. Next slide, please. We're already one ahead. So there it's really said, well, that the full implementation of the convention requires states parties to modify and transform gender stereotypes and eliminate also wrongful gender stereotyping. seeing that as really an important root cause of discrimination of women. But if we compare that to the EU law approach, in the next slide, please, in the Marshall case, then we see that this is one of the exceptional cases in which the court actually also referred to the importance of combating gender stereotyping for realizing equal opportunities of men and women. So next slide, please. Yes. So if we look more generally, what are important other pitfalls in the national and the European legal framework of equality, then it's not just, let's say, this conceptual issue of what is the aim, the normative aim, but it's also about, other elements, you could say, that question how fit for purpose the current laws are in the days, let's say, that we are living. So we live now in a non-binary world, while the legal approach is still very binary. So we still talk about equal treatment of men and women in this legislation, while we have, of course, an LGBTIQ plus community now. And the question is, how does that really fit into the legal framework? I know this has been picked up by the European Parliament in the latest equal pay transparency proposal, but not yet by the Commission proposal itself. But other important aspects here are the intersectional aspect, which is, let's say, still absent from the EU law approach. We have a very fragmented EU law approach. We have gender equality directives, and we have a race directive and a general employment equality directive for yet other grounds of discrimination. But also this fragmented approach fits not very well with the daily reality of people. And then the question of algorithmic discrimination, how fit for purpose are the current directives to deal with that? And there is still the limited scope of EU law itself, the limited substantive scope. And then finally, the individual rights-based approach. So if you move to the next slide, please. I think the individual rights-based approach causes quite some problems in daily practice. If you can move to the next slide, please. Yes, and please, you can move forward, please. So very importantly, what the work of the network shows is that there are very serious limitations to this approach. And there are very few cases actually that make it to court. So what the court cases that we see, we can qualify as the tip of the iceberg. So what national experts year after year indicate as being problematic is, well, first of all, deficient knowledge and training, also of legal practitioners. So that makes it already difficult to know whether you are being discriminated against or not, and whether a court case would be viable or not. Then length and cost of proceedings, time limits, lack of legal aid, the burden of proof, the low compensation that you may get out of going to court, the fact that no class actions may be allowed, the uncertain outcome, the fear of stigma and victimization, the lack of family support, and the lack of trust in legal systems and judicial systems generally. These are really the issues that national experts keep on reporting every year. So next slide, please. And we could say this is coupled also with persisting institutional problems, because we see also lack of institutional commitment. For instance, at the level of social partners, so deficient job classification and evaluation systems. We see little investment of member states in ensuring public monitoring and enforcement and in imposing sanctions. the role of equality bodies and labor inspectorates may still be too limited in securing gender equality. Well, corporate interest that is given and relevance that is given to the issue, low family and community support. So there are and little information and transparency more generally. So these are very serious institutional structural problems that you can never solve basically with an individual rights-based approach. And it puts also a too high of a burden, you could say, on women, on individual claimants that are already in a very vulnerable position, as the member of the European Parliament also just spoke about. So next slide, please. So what I would like to end with this presentation is that we really that is really a big necessity to go beyond an individual rights-based approach and to take a more holistic, comprehensive approach involving all the stakeholders, you could say, all the institutions, all the actors that have a role to play in securing gender equality. So not just the individual claimants, the courts and the policymakers, but the employers, the supervisory bodies, trade unions, civil society, let's say, should work to a more collective approach. And to share the optimism I have in this field with you in my last slide. The next one, please, is that if we really scrutinize the legislative actions of the Commission in recent years, so the Equal Pay Transparency and Better Enforcement Mechanism Directive, the Gender Balance Board Directive, the two directive proposals the Commission put forward on setting standards for national equality bodies, and the Violence Against Women directive proposal that was also mentioned already, I would say we can see a kind of paradigm shift here, at least a recognition on the part of the European Commission that we need to have a more shared public-private approach, and that there is a kind of, I would say, even constitutional responsibility of a variety of institutions to ensure gender equality. And this underscores both its relevance still as an individual fundamental right, but also it reflects more that this is really a collective and a public interest and a societal core value that can only be ensured with a better and greater involvement of all these actors that have an important role to play. So this is what these new legislative proposals reflect, and the fact that the Equal Pay Transparency Directive was actually a political agreement was achieved very quickly, certainly in comparison with other previous proposals in this field, gives me a hope for the future that, you know, we get to this more collective approach and really to also combat more structural problems and hopefully make a contribution to transformative equality also in that context. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope I did not take too much time for my presentation.
Thank you, Linda. Bedankt. And now we'll ask for questions for you. Galdera bada, aretoan, Lindarentzat, ez dago tarte handirik egia esan, baina saiatuko
We will try to make some questions to Linda. If there's anybody having any questions for Linda, so well, I'll take this advantage to make some questions. Well, Linda, you were talking about the concept of the gender equality warranty, and you asked for a more global approach to this, and you said that you were optimistic because there was a change in the paradigm. Where do you see this optimism where we we've seen all over Europe. We can listen to messages which are contrary to this idea, even against equality. How can you see that optimism?
Well, the optimism I see that actually, I think at least where the council is acting with a qualified majority voting, we can see that some political agreement now is being achieved, and even that we had, after a decade, still agreement also on this gender balanced boards directive. It shows that at least in still a majority of the member states, I think there is a strong support for gender equality, but it doesn't indeed do away that we see also very important backlash, at least in a number of European countries, that is very worrying. But for me, it really underscores also how important it is that we are still making progress on these very important legislative files, and that we see that the Commission is also proposing here this more collective approach. For me, that's at least where I see some hope for the future, that, let's say, a seed has been planted in a way to say, well, even though you could say, well, I would like to achieve much more than what is now in these current proposals, but at least a seed is planted that there must be more stringent monitoring, supervision, and that it's not just put on the shoulders of women to fight for an individual right in a court, while we have a very persisting structural problem of discrimination and inequality. So I see it as, if you take the timeline over starting from 1957 and where we are now, then we see that all these seeds that have been planted also by national courts that refer questions to the Court of Justice, they have already secured that at least, we have now at least a strong constitutional principle that allows for at least still making further progress. But it doesn't take away that there are many issues, of course, to worry about. But I see some lights also on the horizon, so to speak.
That's it. We need big and strong trees growing from those seeds, right?
Yes, yes, indeed.
Okay, hemen bukatuta emango dugu beraz, ez badago beste galderarik.
I think there aren't any other questions, so we are going to finish with Linda Senden's participation. Thank you so much. Thank you for your participation.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Linda Senden beraz, Holandatik Utrechtik izan dugu bideokonferentzia bidez.
Well, we had Linda Senden from Utrecht, and we had them from Zoom. Well, I don't know what time it is. Well, I think we've a bit delayed, but we are going to continue. Well, now we are going to give the floor to the round table. We will have two people invited to attendees, and the name of this roundtable is Legislation as an Essential Tool for Progress Towards Equality. I would also like to invite Neus Pociello y Cayuela from the Institute of Women of Catalonia. Then we have Sandra from the Commission for Citizenship and Gender Equality, and we will also have Lena Ag, who will take part via video conference. Let's see if we can see Lena Ag, because she's in Sweden. Well, there we have her. Welcome.
I will introduce every one of you, okay? Os presento a las tres ponentes.
Neus Pozuello y Cayuela is the director of the Catalan Women's Institute of the Department of Equality and Feminism of the Government of Catalonia, and her appointment, she was an active member of the Barcelona Women's Council, the National Women's Council of Catalonia, the United Nations Working Group on Aging, and vice president of the Spanish National Council of Women.
Let's say hello again to Lena Ag, who is in Sweden. Good morning, Lena. Welcome. I'm very pleased to meet you again. First of all, I will introduce you, as I told you before. Lena Ag is Director General of Swedish Gender Equality Agency since its inception in January 2018. Prior to becoming Director General of the Swedish Gender Equality Agency, Lena Ag was Secretary General of the Kvinna till Kvinna Foundation, one of the world's largest supporters of women's organizations in conflict-affected regions. Kvinna till Kvinna is the recipient of the prestigious Right Livelihood Award, also known as the Alternative Nobel Prize. At the beginning of her career, Lena Ag worked in the media industry but moved on to engage in civil society in a broad variety of organizations like Greenpeace International and the Swedish Peace and Arbitration Society. Moving from civil society to government and international organizations, Lena Ag worked in the cabinet of the Vice President of the European Commission and in the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Y por último, Sandra Ribeiro, bienvenida. Sandra Ribeiro is the President of the Commission for Citizenship and Gender Equality in Portugal. Ribeiro got a law degree and a postgraduate diploma in labor law and in logistics, both from University of Lisbon Law College. Between 2010 and December 2014, she was president of the Portuguese Commission for Equality in Labor and Employment. And from June 2018 and September 2020, she was the general director of the Directorate General for Employment and Industrial Relations. Vamos a hacer a cada una de las ponentes, por lo tanto, 12 minutos para su intervención y al finalizar sus intervenciones.
Now we are going to give each of the speakers 12 minutes, and at the end of their speeches, we will give way to question time, which will be extended up to 15 minutes. So we are going to listen to the three speakers. We will take all the questions, and then we will open some time for questions. So Neus Pozuello from the Catalan Institute of Women.
Muchísimas gracias. Egunon, good morning, buen día, buenos días a todas. En primer lugar, permitidme que agradezca, ¿no?, esta invitación y poder estar hoy aquí compartiendo esta jornada. Por lo tanto, pues muy agradecidas, ¿no?, a Emakunde por la invitación y muy contentas también, ¿no?
So thank you so much for your invitation. It's a big pleasure to share this roundtable with the director of the Swedish Equality Agency and the president of the Commission of Citizenship and Equality from Portugal. I'll try to synthesize in these 10 minutes to tell you and to launch a framework that allows us to discuss a little bit. In Catalonia, as a general framework, we have to say that the first law was passed in 2008, and it was focused on eliminating the violence typified in Catalonia as gender violence. We are going a step forward to this. This law was approved in 2008, and in 2020 it was updated because we needed to guarantee an alignment with the international and European framework of the legislation. So we wanted this law to be aligned with the Istanbul Agreement and the recommendations made by the EU. So in 2020, we were incorporating several key rights, such as our recommendations, the principle of life diligence, which is recognized in this law. We recognize the institutional violence that is being exercised, and we are not taking any action to act every time we find gender violence anywhere. So this is asking us to work internally to recognize this, and this is the path we are now opening. The mechanisms we will have as a public administration to act when we find a situation of gender violence. So we have also created a new framework protocol, a new models to approach gender violence. In 2015, we had the Catalan Equality Law, which is the framework, the umbrella. Of course, this law includes many articles related to gender violence, but it also embraces a whole spectrum of actions that we have to boost from the public institutions in education, health, etc. So this law was passed, this act was passed in 2015, and after 5 years of being deployed, we had to evaluate it, and we had some results, and we needed to act. So we've seen different questions, different issues in this assessment, and we see that the legal framework, the regulatory framework is not enough because it is not easy to bring into practice this mainstreaming, not only from the public policies, but also from the internal mainstreaming process, because mainstreaming can be grouped in two different groups of mechanisms. Some of them can be worked beforehand, and some of them have to be worked on afterwards. I'm going to give you an example. The reports of impact on gender. Any initiative carried out by our government, even if it was related to education, economy, employment, etc., had to be accompanied by this report on the gender impact. This tool is an afterwards tool. This is not going to allow us to correct many things. Of course, we are going to be able to make some contrast, but if we haven't done anything beforehand, it will be very difficult to correct anything. So we can start from analyzing from a gender perspective. This is something that is already done before designing the public policies, this gender analysis, as I was saying, and apart from that, we have to create other mechanisms so that this perspective is incorporated into this initiative. And I will give you some examples later, because this law has been monitored in Catalonia from a single interdepartmental commission or committee, and we've worked only within a sole commission for the whole range of inequalities, discrimination, and violence. So the assessment already tells us that it has been really complex, really difficult, because we've seen this law from the umbrella of recommendations to incorporate this. We've perceived from the sectorial policy this change of paradigm. We are not talking about policies for women or sectorial policies. We are talking about cross policies, cross-sectional policies, and the steps that we've given as a government. The government of Catalonia really established 4 axes of transformation: democracy, green, economic, and the the feminist approach. So we really want to incorporate this feminist approach, which seems to be an intersectional and feminist perspective incorporated to the whole governmental action. So we need a structure which is at the same level as the other departments. So we created this regional ministry with a structure that really was the mirror to what we wanted to do, because we wanted to have a feminist intersectional perspective. So we have some feminist secretariats, and we've got 3 general directorates, but there's a specific directorate to eliminate the gender violence, and also another directorate related to caring, and we have another one devoted to migration, LGBT, promotion of human rights. So the structure seems to be quite messy, but in the end, I want to say that the structure has to help us to deploy some policies and continue with the mandates of this legal framework. This way, we've been able to introduce and go more in depth in the approach based on the human rights. So we have to focus to make an approach from the human rights and discrimination. We have to be under the umbrella of this mainstreaming. And as the Catalan Institute for Women, I already had this mandate coming from this law telling me that as an institute I had to accompany the other departments to incorporate the gender perspective, and with this small structure I could create the reports, but it wasn't easy to sit on the same table, to work in the pay gap, for example, and I will talk to you later about some policies we've been able to develop. So it was really very difficult. But with this structure, when I had to improve the model of attention to women, I can work within this structure so that the anti-capacitist perspective is incorporated. So the service, which is part of the Catalan Institute for Women, can guarantee the access of all women, and we don't leave anybody aside. I think that I'm running out of time. I don't really know how long I've been talking for, so I think that we are talking about 4 Equality Acts, because the new law that is being generating refers to a specific law for the LGTB collective. We also have a law relating to equal treatment and non-discrimination. So we finally created an office of equal treatment and non-discrimination, complementing some of the gaps that our law had. For example, regarding the penalties when talking about sexist communication. So thanks to this umbrella, we can have a vehicle to continue working on this. It is essential that the structure is there so that we can guarantee the transversality, the mainstreaming of these actions. Of course, we also need to update the law and to make it be incorporated into this new approach. But one of the questions that I think is relevant is the question of governance. When we elaborate laws, when we write laws, sometimes there's an involvement during the previous questions, but during the follow-up, there's no involvement. So in Catalonia, what we are doing is that we are creating an interdepartmental commission so that for any plan there's always an interdepartmental commission for this strategy, because the Department of Health is not only involved, but of course we need to work on other things to incorporate, to continue making some progress in this perspective. And we have to look inside to change things we are not doing correctly. We've launched a measure to recognize some free days related to menstruation. As an example, we start from the inside. Regarding the strategy, we announced a couple of days ago that the long-term contraceptives will be free for women up to 29 years old. So this wouldn't have been possible if we hadn't had this interdepartmental committee. So the equality policies and laws cannot depend only on equality organizations, but we need every different parts in the government to be involved, not only the definition, but as far as it regards funding, and of course the follow-up actions. Well, I think that I gave you some information, and I think we'll have some more time later for discussion.
Now we're going to Sweden and hand the floor to Lena
Director General of the Swedish Gender Equality Agency. We're waiting and listening for you.
Well, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, excellent, excellent. And thank you so much for inviting me to this important conversation. It's really a great value for us to engage in this kind of exchange and of experiences and good practices. So thank you so much. I want to make 3 points here in this roundtable. And first of all, the importance of a holistic and comprehensive approach to the work aimed at advancing gender equality, as Linda Senden also pointed out in her keynote. Second, the role of legislation in changing norms in society. And third, the importance of government coordination and institutionalization at all levels, and collaboration with civil society organizations, academia, labor unions, etc. What, interestingly enough, Linda in her keynote called a collective approach. So I want to say something under these 3 points. So Sweden has a holistic approach to the work aimed at advancing gender equality. And the overarching goal for the Swedish gender equality policy is that women and men shall have the same power to shape society and their own lives. And there are 6 sub-goals regarding power and influence, economic gender equality, education, unpaid care and domestic work, gender equality in healthcare and health services, and the elimination of men's violence against women. So you can see it covers the whole societal spectrum, you can say. So the Swedish Gender Equality Agency is mandated by the government to conduct policy analysis and monitoring in relation to gender equality policy goals. So what we do is we continuously analyze and monitor the progress towards the gender equality policy goals in order to identify and address potential gaps or emerging new issues. So in this context, I would like to emphasize the importance of evidence-based policymaking. This includes, of course, sex-aggregated data and gender statistics. Without that, we would be left all, in the dark. My agency also has a supporting role towards other government agencies on gender mainstreaming. And we also provide grants for women's mobilization to gender equality projects and projects on violence prevention in the area of men's violence against women. I also want to stress that the long-term approach is pivotal here. The Swedish gender equality policy goal has remained, all the main goal and all the 6 goals has remained there, irrespective of the change of government. So in 2017, the government launched a 10-year national strategy to prevent and combat men's violence against women, and that is a strategy mirroring the Istanbul Convention. Now, the role of legislation in changing norms. Legislation do play an important part in advancing gender equality, but it needs to be alongside other measures. And I will give you a concrete example. We amended in Sweden the criminal code in 2018, criminalizing non-consensual sexual acts, including rape. So we now have a consent-based legislation. And not everyone, when it came, it had been on the agenda for a long time for the women's movement in Sweden. But in order to understand what this actually means, the understanding of this new approach, the government mandated the Swedish Crime Victim Compensation and Support Authority to undertake different actions to disseminate information and to increase awareness of this new legislation, including actions targeting young people. Also, the school curricula have been altered to include, as part of the comprehensive sexuality education, covering sexuality, consent, and relationships, as well as honor-related violence and oppression. So it's kind of a holistic approach, if you see. Thirdly, as I said, the importance of government coordination and institutionalization, which my agency is an example of, and we have only been in Sweden for 5 years, I have to tell you. So it's kind of new in a way. We are kind of new in a way. The Swedish Gender Equality Agency was established to promote sustainable and strategic gender equality work, as well as coordination. And based on our experience of supporting gender mainstreaming, we have now developed a method of systematic exchange and learning. And this method is a way of strengthening accountability and maintaining a focus on results, not on activities, but results, and ensuring a thorough understanding of the underlying gender inequality problems in a particular sector. And this goes also for all the societal levels. We are a national agency, but we also coordinate and cooperate, you can say, and have partnerships on regional levels and local levels. So we know that gender equality results at the societal level requires the cooperation and the collaboration between government agencies also active in the same sectors. It also requires, of course, financial and human resources. And of great importance is also engaging with civil society, academia, labor unions, on these common efforts, as Linda pointed out, and this is what we're trying to do. Now, finally, in all this, essential to this is, of course, political will and leadership at the top. Thank you.
Eskerrik asko, Lena
Thank you so much, Lina Ag. And now Sandra Ribeiro will have the floor.
Buenos días a todos y todas. Muchas gracias por la invitación. Ahora voy a hablar inglés para no molestar con mi horrible portuñol. It is indeed a great honor to me to be here as president of the Portuguese Commission for Citizenship and Gender Equality and on the behalf of the Portuguese government. History is made of many, many stories. Portugal has a dark past in gender equality. Until not so long ago, less than 50 years, the Portuguese Civil Code had a provision that recognized that husbands was the chief of the family and the wife and children should obey him always in any circumstances. At the same time, other legal provisions forbade women to be a lawyer, to be a judge, or open a business without formal permission from their fathers if they were single, or their husbands if they were married. And of course, they could not vote. And by the way, domestic violence was not a crime. Actually, it was a crime if it was perpetrated by the women, because if it was by the men, it was okay. So, heading to our Catholic heritage, gender inequality was written in the law and it was mandatory. And this is not so long ago. I am still under 50 years old, and all of this was in force when I was born. My grandmother, my mother, and my older sister lived under this legal system for gender inequality. So when we look today to the Portuguese legal framework and we look back, of course we realize that there is an abyssal distance. The democratic revolution in 1974 was a radical cut with the legal patriarchal system. Freedom and social rights are not compatible whatsoever with any type of legal credit to gender inequality. The Portuguese constitution, originally approved in 1976, since her first version, has one of its fundamental milestones to say that equality between all persons is mandatory, and expressly refers to that promoting gender equality is a state task. And today, Portuguese legislation is many times referred to be a very modern and complete legal framework concerning to equality and non-discrimination. But when we see the numbers, when we collect data, then we see that the past still have a persistent shadow that haunts our day-to-day. In the simple things, the most easy thing became the most complex and endemic problems, like gender-based violence, social tolerance, domestic violence numbers, gender pay gap, professional segregation, glass ceiling, work-life family out of balance, LGBT plus intolerance, and we realize that equality, gender equality, is still an ongoing process, and a lot must be done. But of course, we need to recognize that especially in the last 2 decades in Portugal, government have counted gender equality as an important field to all policies. Gender mainstreaming became a major preoccupation in the government programs, and a lot of measures and actions are being designed to try to remove all the evident obstacles to the full participation of women in all spheres, public and private, with pioneering initiatives with a view to achieving a more egalitarian society. That is true. To do so, one of the major achievements is the adoption of the National Strategy for Equality and Non-Discrimination, 28-2013, Portugal More Equal, that it was approved by all the ministers. And this is aligned with the 2030 agenda, of course, and we have 3 major areas to work on, and where we have action plans, which is promoting equality between women and men, preventing and combating violence against women and domestic violence, and combating discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. And these 3 action plans are based on the definition of strategic strategic objectives, and we have more than 130 concrete measures that we work for with plans set of 4 years, then evaluation, then more 4 years, and go on and go on. So the action plans emphasize the multi-dimensional nature of the disadvantage, and of course that idea of intersectional that need to work in a holistic way with all the discrimination factors like sex, age, disability, race, national and ethnic origin as well. Of course, that under this wide strategy, labor market plays a very important role. And there is before pandemic and after pandemic in here as well. And if the pandemic brought a lot of problems, it brought new things, and it brought a new era and a new way of seeing the working organization, especially with working times and the possibility of work from home or from wherever. And this is something that, of course, it's not applied to all kind of professions, but for example, in public administration, there's a lot of professions that can be done by teleworking. And this is something that we are working very much in this moment. Not a total teleworking, not every day, it's a hybrid teleworking, but what we found is that this is something important if it's not used only by women. Because it is to be used only by women, well, then we have a problem again, and we're going to have a backlash, and we're going to lose positions that we already won in the public or private labor market. But what we see until now, it's been 50-50, and this is quite okay, and we see that is very interesting in a work-life family way of work. Of course, then we have to be aware of the risk of working much more hours than we did before, and we lost the schedules, and we lost the frontiers between work time and lazy time. And so this is something very, very important, because it's very easy. Then you just look at the watch and you understood that you work like 20, we work like 12 or 30 hours and not the 7 or the 8 that we should. So again, we need to be pay attention, but it's something that is quite interesting to see. And of course, Portugal have a lot of good laws, but we still have gender pay gap, 14%, and this moment is getting down. But it's important to see that Portugal is one of the countries that have less part-time in Europe, which means that we have, which means that this difference, this pay gap, is really at paying time. It's not because women work less hours. They do the same hours than men, but they receive less. Of course, it's not anymore same work, less money. Not so much, but is most the indirect discrimination. Segregation, professional segregation. We still have more women working on care, on health, on education, and much men working on engineer, digital, and that are the sectors that are much well paid than the others. So here we still have this problem. So during, of course, during the pandemic, we had a problem with the employment, feminine employment, especially because of the tourism. We closed the doors during 2020, 2021. And a lot of women lost their job at that time, but then they won again working in care, because care was something very important during this time. But what we saw is that nothing happened in the salaries, which means that care and cleaning became the most important sectors during 2020. They were working, the other ones were at home, but what happened as a value in that work? Nothing. Everything the same. So this is quite interesting because, and I read in your concept note that law is very important, but it's not enough. And it's true. We have a lot of good laws. We have laws since 2017 to establish the minimum thresholds between sexes to get gender balanced representation on the boards. We arrived here before the directive that was just approved some months ago. We already have this, and of course we improved. You already have 40% of women on boards because we have this quota system. And we have a law that obliges the parliament as well to have at least 40% of women, and of course we have it. We have this law to oblige to enterprises to have these transparent salary systems to show why they pay something to men and why they pay to women. We all have this, but when we look at the numbers, we have this reality that what is happening on the field every day, it's quite away still from our laws. So that's why we think that, and I'm very interested in this pact that you made just last year, because this is something that we are thinking very much for a long time now, and I hope that we can really get there, is to, when we have already good laws that we do, but when how to make this a success, how can we really, we need to, first of all, have the capacity to measure the impact of our laws, gender impact. And this is very, very complicated. We already have in the state budget law that we should do, that all the services, public service, should do those budgets in a gender perspective. But this is very complicated to do. Of course, that what we need is to gather all ministerial areas. And this means that we need to have leadership for equality. All together, and really understand that all ministers must be a little minister for equality. It's not only the minister for la mujer, it's not only the minister for equality, it's minister, financial minister, health minister, education minister, all of them, women and men, they should have a little bit, a rainbow of equality minister. Because this is the only way that we can really make a formal transformation. Because every sector has a gender impact. And this must be appropriated by all ministers and all the governments, because this is so complicated when we say to finance or to health or something that, oh, but what about the gender impact? And says, but it's not. This is not with me. This is with you. You are the equality minister. And says, no, because every law you do has a gender impact. Says, oh, come. Let's talk about public transportation, for example. When you change the circuits, or when you do new stop buses somewhere, if you don't realize, if you are not aware that women are the most, are the major people that utilize this kind of public transportation, and if you do a bus stop very far away and with no lights, probably you are creating a gender impact problem. I said, oh, okay. Oh, never thought about this. Of course, we need to see this in a global and holistic way. So that's why social pacts are, in our point of view, the way that we should go from now. We already have the legal framework. We can always improve, of course, but The bases are here. Now what we need is that the law get out totally out of the paper and come to the streets, and that is made by the social pacts. Social pacts are important and are powerful. Law is not enough to eradicate a sexist culture. It is a lot, it is essential, but needs society commitment, governmental commitment, needs financial investment. Yes, we need money to do this. This is important to understand. And the mainstream perspective, of course, in all sectorial areas. Needs leadership to equality at all levels, because equality is not impossible. Thank you.
Obrigado, Sandra.
De nada.
11:20, os he prometido que iba a haber un turno de preguntas.
Well, I told you that we were going to have some time for questions.
Sandra con Elena, a través de videoconferencia.
We will have this time for questions right now. If you want to make any questions, we are going to have 10 minutes for questions. So if there is any question, please, you can place them now, because we have here with us these political representatives. Well, I think there's someone wanting to ask something out there.
Bueno, lo primero, gracias por las ponencias. A ver si consigo expresar lo que quiero expresar. Mi pregunta es un poco en línea con el tema de la transversalidad, ¿no?
Well, I was going to ask something regarding mainstreaming and the significance of the different departments from different public institutions. How can we focus on these gender gaps and how we can reduce them from different levels? And of course, there's a lack of commitment sometimes from institutions, and this lack of political will. How could we work on that, taking into account that this is where we take the decisions from regarding economic investment and so on? So how could we work in this political commitment? So this is my question.
Claro, un poco el planteamiento. Planteas como
Well, you are talking about different scenarios, because the strategy probably needs to be different. If we're talking about a scenario as the one we have in Catalonia right now, with a department for equality and feminism sitting on the same table, there's an expression in Catalan which says, sitting on the table of the elderly. So the strategy would be different if we had the possibility to be on the same table, because this mainstreaming I was talking about is the political dimension of mainstreaming, because mainstreaming needs to be integrated into all the processes of governance, not only when talking about involvement of transparency. There are other spaces, the technical committee, for example. There are internal spaces where we need to build a specific mechanism, but this is the place where the general secretaries of the different departments are discussing, and this is where we need mainstreaming, and this is a space of our own governance, the government's governance itself. So this would be the ideal scenario, and we need to work here in training, because from this ideal scenario, the senior directors of the department need to train other directors in the department. So these are simply symbols, but they are really necessary to get this mainstreaming. When the scenario is not so optimum, when we have smaller structures, even when we don't have any structure at all, we need to open new ways with other mainstreaming tools. when the political dimension doesn't work, we need to work with different kinds of mainstreaming. We need to do our best, even if the level is lower, to generate as many strategies as possible, common plans, and so on. And this is really necessary, not only this Bell framework, what I fund, what I don't, where I work. So from this not so ideal scenario, we need to get this strategy to go to a lower level, and we need to create gender impact reports. Sometimes we are a bit late, but we don't have to use them as a correcting measure, but to open a path. So when we have this with us, we've got the department saying, well, we've got this mandate and we can start working on this new stone. Of course, it is much more difficult. And to give you some figures, when we have a political and a structural scenario which is optimum, we don't have a good scenario for the report, for example. So in 2020, we had 146 reports on gender impact. But when we have this political positioning framework, the gender impact reports have been 280, but this is the quantity, but we need to talk about quality. In the first ones, we had like 600 contributions. Here we have like 3,900 contributions in these reports. So this means that the model has changed, that we are going to very specific measures, and there's a position within the government so that we can make some progress to guarantee the rights from these feminist perspectives, and we are open to recognize new rights.
We can see that both Lena and Linda raised hands. So first, Lena, if you want to make any comments.
Yes, well, thank you so much. First of all, I really have to congratulate you to the equality law. I didn't do that before, but of course it's really important with legal frameworks and regulations, you know. And then we can talk about implementation and dissemination, and I think that I just wanted to comment on the question from the floor, and on political will, etc. Now, how to get, you know, of course we all know it's about political will, about leadership, and so on, but politicians will not do things by themselves, so to speak. There needs to be public opinion, and that is why it's so important to bring in civil society, the women's movement to the tables when we talk about these things. And I would say the Swedish experience is that you know, gender equality is a long political struggle, and it needs push from you know, public opinion. So that's one thing. And then I also want to underline, you know, sometimes we in the gender equality business, so to say, or field, we use a kind of very expert language, and you know, gender mainstreaming, for instance, it's not always easy to understand what it means. And I think, you know, we give out handbooks, and it's, you know, it can be really tricky for like a local authority or something to go through all of the, you know, the text and so on. So my advice to people who are really interested to start to do gender mainstreaming is to start with something. Identify one thing in your operations that is, you know, that has a gender inequality, and start with that, because then you will know a lot of how to do. But you need to identify a problem first, of course, and then you need to have, you know, the data there in order to support you. Because if you don't have sex aggregated data, or you don't have gender statistics, etc., you don't know what you're supposed to do. So I think, I know maybe I contradict myself, but it's not, you should not complicate things too much, because if you do the whole field of, you know, inequalities from economic to men's violence to school systems to everything, you will just lose yourself there. So if I may say, this is something, you know, sort of on a more technical level, to start with one or two inequality problems. And then finally, gender equality is not only women's, it's not only women's business, it's men's business as well. And, you know, there are inequalities in our societies that also includes men. So we need to have these kind of glasses on that is, you know, towards both men and women. But we can see, of course, today that women is disproportionately, and as Linda said, you know, also that there is discrimination on many levels against women. But, you know, men suffer too. And I'll give you an example from Sweden, is that when it comes to women, you know, health effects, we can see, for instance, that in Sweden, on a, you know, when it comes to psychiatrical diseases and so on, you know, a lot of women and young women suffer from psychological problems and so on, but men does too. It's just when they don't go to the doctor, they don't go to the psychiatrist, you know, some of them take their own lives. I mean, they don't go, you know, they don't go to the doctor in time, because there is this notion that if you're a man, you're supposed to handle everything. And of course, that's not true. We know that, you know. We are only human beings, all of us. And so that was my little intervention.
Thank you, Lena. We only have just a couple of minutes more, but I can also see that Linda has raised her hand. So if you want make any comment or question, Linda, it's your turn.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Yeah, and actually I had a question for Lena, because I was quite intrigued. I mean, that's what came indeed to the fore from our comparative work, that there is this Swedish Equality Agency. And as far as I've been able to establish, that's quite indeed innovative across the EU. And actually an institutional approach I would advocate for much more countries. And we see the Equal Pay Transparency proposal making a step a bit, I think, into that direction. But what I would like to ask you is how you see, or what is the mandate of your agency when compared to other national, equality bodies and ombudsman, etc. So how do you see the added value of your own agency? And how is it indeed organized at the level of financial and human resources? Because I think that's a fundamental problem, and several speakers, I think, alluded to this. And if I just take the comparison with what happened in the field of data protection, where we saw that there was a kind of economic value to fundamental right of data protection, we see huge investments also in national monitoring bodies with hundreds of people being hired as civil servants. And this doesn't compare in any way to the investment made in national equality body. So I'm very curious to hear your, what you can say on this.
Let me be very, very brief then, because we don't have much time. And thank you very much for the question. When it comes to the difference between our agency and our, you know, anti-discrimination ombudsman, there is a clear difference, because, but it's not, you know, it's not maybe something that sort of catches the eye immediately. But the ombudsman is, this is the simplification, right? They do the individual cases of discrimination. We work on a structural level towards the gender equality goals. That's the short answer to your question. And you know, we can get in touch afterwards and have a conversation on this. And then you said,
resources.
Yeah, resources. Yes, we have. I would say, compared with, we are a middle. What do you say? Resource structure. So that, I mean, we are about 120 people, and we get resources from the government, through certain budget lines and so on. So that's. So that there is a commitment, from the political level that this is supposed to, we support the government in what they try to achieve when it comes to gender equality, and then so that is the short answer. Of course, I agree completely. You need resources and human resources, and you need financial resources.
So let's make an appointment then between Lena and Linda for a longer chat, okay?
Yeah, I would be happy to learn more about it, for sure.
Sandra, si quieres.
No, if there's something else you want to add to close?
Just connected with the question that someone from the audience made, I think that how can we concrete this commitment? And it's of course complicated, but what Lena said is very interesting as well. That the way we communication is very, very important in here. And really, we need to simplify because sometimes the gender speech is very complex many times, and this is not good. This is not good because sometimes we put people going away from us when we start to be very complex about our ideas and our reasons. So I think that using data, it's very, very important because numbers speak very, very loud when we show them. And that's very important when we see a graphic and we can really show that where the inequality is. And the communication, if we really can simplify our message, that is very important. This subject that I was talking about, gender budgeting, for example, it's the cherry and the top of the cake of the complexity. Usually it's very complicated to talk about gender budgeting. But indeed, if we be more straight to the point, which is that when we put money in any kind of measure, in any kind of law, now let's do some data, sex segregation, and see if, for example, if we are talking about minimum salary, let's see if there is more women or more men having this minimum salary. Let's see what is the impact. So it's by examples, by practical examples, it's a good way to pass the information in our institutions where we are, and if we are working in a government, we are with our governmental colleagues. I think that use simple conversation and examples, practical examples, and numbers and data is tools that can really help us, because of course we know when we work in this field we have to have a great resistance to frustration, because sometimes it's really complicated and take many years to, sometimes when a law, like for example this pay gap law that Portugal just approved in 2018, and now is very similar to the new directive that is almost approved. And I said, 10 years ago, we already were spoken about this, and we were spoken about how important should be having transparent systems to explain salaries, and how important it is to be public what each person wants in a company. But when we have the idea and we have the conversation, usually only 10 years later, it's going to happen. So it's a long-term running that once we are in this work, we need to be very strong, and especially never lose the optimistic side, because it's very important. Thank you.
I think it's rather clear the way we need to follow. We need a global perspective, a mainstreaming perspective to gender equalities in the future. Neus Pociello, Sandra Ribeiro, Lena Ag, Linda Senden, thank you so much for being here today, and I hope to see you very soon. Thank you so much.
Espera, ¿no? Tenemos a... Pasa.
Sí. Chao.
Tanto Neus como Sandra pueden bajar a sus sillas porque a veces es incómodo estar aquí con 200 ojos que clavan.
They're going back to the seats, Sandra and Neus. Well,
jardunaldiaren itxirari begira jarriko gara beraz, bi ponentzia entzunda,
we're going to continue with the last part of this event now, and taking into account the starting point of this event. As you know, the Parliament has passed the modification of the law to continue progressing in equality. Now we've got the director of Emakunde, Miren Elgarresta, and we are going to continue to see which are the challenges of this law and the possible progress. So you've got the floor, Ms. Elgarresta.
Bueno, lehenik eta behin eskerrak zuei parte hartzen ari zareten pertsona guztiei. Benetan ez gendun espero horrelako erantzun zabala. Ziur naiz, jardunaldi hau kokatuko bagenu atzera begira, gure legea onartu zen 2005 urtearen bere urteurrenean, 2006an.
Well, we are celebrating the anniversary of the implementation of this law, and if we weren't celebrating this, we wouldn't have such a big audience today. Well, I think this was a great progress, and of course, there's a long way to follow before us. So thank you so much for being here, for accompanying us, and thanks to the team, the technicians, because thanks to them it's been possible to organize this event. And I would also like to thank the speakers for taking part in this event from very different perspectives. María Eugenia Rodríguez Palop, Neus Pociello, Sandra Ribeiro, Lena Ag. I don't know if I've been able to pronounce the names properly. Linda Senden, thank you so much for your participation. And today, as I was saying, we are celebrating the first anniversary of this law that was passed 1 year ago. Well, the reform was passed last year, but the law was passed in 2005, and I think this is a very important benchmark. The goal of this law was very clear, but it was not limited to achieving equality, but it was also approaching other aspects, such as trying to fight against inequalities and intervene in the structures promoting these inequalities. Thanks to this law, we've been able to make a lot of progress in the prevention of gender violence, also in the attention to gender violence, also in policies to promote equality policies. This has been a great reference, and this has been based on the consideration that had by the UN, because we've received an award by the UN for the enactment of this law. So today on the 3rd March 2022, this law was passed, and this is our first anniversary. Of course, there have been many changes, and we need to give value to them. We are before a change in the paradigm. Our social context has changed a lot. The rules have also changed, the regulations, and of course, our law needed to be adapted to this new social context. So, in this 2005 law, we also changed some articles. So now I'm going to, well, I know we are running out of time, so I try to be very brief, but my intervention was supposed to be like this. First, I was going to talk, well, now I'm going to change into Spanish for my intervention because I've been talking in Basque too much. So now I'm going to talk about the different measures to incorporate the gender perspective. We are going to talk about the challenges and the new situations. Well, we are going to talk about the measures to promote equality in different fields. This gender mainstreaming we've been talking about this morning that needs to have an impact on other social policies. I will also try very briefly to talk about the progress in this first anniversary of the reformation of our law, of our act. And I'm going to talk about the areas we've been working on in Emakunde. So when talking about the structure, the architecture, the institutional architecture, we can say that after the creation of Emakunde and together with the boost of the law itself in 2005, we've made some changes in the structure, in the architecture, because we've been focused on building the appropriate structures and qualifying people. So all the departments of the Basque country government and also the provincial councils have administrative units devoted to equality, and they're boosting policies for 90% of the citizenship. So the equality jump has been really big because we've multiplied by 3 the number of staff devoted to equality. We've also talked about the need to work more in depth in the coordination of institutions and also within the institutions themselves. Of course, this has to be done at a local, regional, and national, European, and international level. This coordination is really important because we need to make an appeal to the provincial councils and the local councils to work on this. Regarding the resources, the new law is also expliciting the 1% of the general budget that has to be devoted to equality measures. This is not only impacting the policies, but this gender mainstreaming needs to reach other sectorial policies. When talking about the statistics, if we talk about them, it is, of course, essential to have objective figures. We need this data. And we think it is important to enlarge the knowledge that we have about equality between women and men. And we are working already on a Basque Observatory for Equality between women and men. Of course, the law has contributed a lot to develop sensitive studies, and we've been able to enlarge the knowledge regarding inequalities and interests and differences between women and men. The training of people is also regulated. We are going to continue working on equality politics and policies. We need a minimum training, a basic training, and the law, apart from that, also foresees a basic, compulsory, progressive, and permanent training in equality. I don't know. Well, I think I'm okay. I don't know if I've missed anything. Well, another essential question is how the equality law has favored the planification, and we need an assessment and some indicators helping us to have good diagnosis. We need to extend the need to have plans and to apply them to many other agents. Nowadays, in Euskadi, apart from the Basque departments, also the provincial councils and many local councils have this working tool. And you can see it here in this image. There are many municipalities having equality plans, and you can see that they've been multiplied by 4. So these plans are the umbrella that have an impact on 92% of the population in the Basque Country. Now I'm moving towards the second part, the measures to promote equality. And here I'm going to talk about the political participation and involvement. The equality law had a great impact, and it was key because it promoted the women's empowerment and strengthened women's social and political involvement. So at least 50% of parliamentary and provincial councils candidates had to be women. And this was a very significant benchmark because it changed the way in which political activity was carried out in our country. These are the figures. 50.7% of MPs are women, and here we can see that there's an equal representation in the parliament. Of course, there's a long way to go yet, but we've got an increasing number of mayores. There are a lot of fields in which we have to contribute a lot. We've got different organizations and trade unions and so on. Well, there are many differences in senior directing positions, for example. So even if the equality index is very advanced at a European level, but this is the field or the area where we are not doing enough. So this is why we need to continue working on this, and we've got a new campaign now in favor of female leadership for women to be able to continue going further in this representation at senior management in companies and institutions. When talking about culture, well, culture seems for us a key element to promote equality. We prompted the creation of Begira, the Advisory Commission for a Non-Sexist Use of Advertising and Communication. Of course, we can also make complaints, and we need to guarantee the equal and non-sexist use of advertising and media messages. And we have to continue working on this on the internet, social media, and video games. As far as it regards work, our law has broken many barriers because inequalities in the labor market has changed, especially in the housework and the caring sector. We are trying to give value and economic value to the unpaid domestic work in the Basque Country. In 2018, it was valued as 27%, but we need to continue giving value to the unpaid domestic work, and we have to consolidate positive actions to hire women in sectors where they are underrepresented. We've got a symptom, the pay gap, of course, and even if a lot of progress has been made, we've been able to go from the 27% to the 19.5% in 2019, but we think that there's a lot to do in this sense. According to the figures we have, I think that nowadays the pay gap is of around 14%. Another strategic area is conciliation and co-responsibility, because we have to visualize that the co-responsible conciliation is something that involves women and men. Women usually take care of the caring part of the work, and well, we've got the figures there. There's a very positive figure here, and I think it's important to highlight this, is that as far as it regards the children care permissions asked by men, they have increased. It is true that women have multiplied by 2.5 the requests for these permissions, but men have also multiplied them by 7%, by 7. Of course, education is essential, and we need to establish guidelines, education guidelines at all levels, and we need to reinforce the co-education work in the classroom, co-education plans, co-education and equality officers, teacher training, and we need to continue working to avoid the gender roles, because many times the training itinerary is very influenced by the gender. This is the figure that is given by the Gender Equality Index, calculated by Eustat. There's a positive progress, but we need to continue working on this, and this is making reference to this sensitivity campaign we've just deployed. We want to continue having women's representation in other aspects, but we also want men to be represented in other fields, such as education, health, and so on. And there's a lot of work to be done. These are the figures that we have, the representation of women. You see the difference, but if we look at these figures more in detail, we see that in the automotive sector, for example, women don't reach 5%. Other social rights, we are talking about health, environment, etc. But social inclusion continues being a challenge, and poverty is still female. So 6 out of 10 people receiving public benefits are women. So we have to continue pursuing the welfare and the autonomy of women, and this is why we are working on payment of alimony and maintenance payments, supplements for the lowest widows and widowers' pensions, personal assistance to mothers with disabilities, participation of older women in political, economic, social, and cultural life. But we also want to fight for the real and effective equality for women of foreign, migrant, or other nationality, as well as Roma women, and the response to the situations, conditions, and needs of women with disabilities, as well as for women prisoners and homeless and severely socially excluded. Our law needs to be directed to the violence against women. We need to change a lot in this sense, and many of the changes are devoted to that. Our law was a pioneer reflecting the direct link between inequalities and gender violence. And here there's a featured element item. Here I have a figure, the number of claims for gender violence. Even if we think that 19.1% increase is a negative figure, I think that thanks to tools such as the law and services that have been deployed, we've been able to show violence, and we've been able to bring it to the surface. And now it's not only the peak of the iceberg. We are bringing women to the public sphere from the private sphere so that we can really tackle violence against women. We need to continue making a bet for policies in this sense. We've finally been able to sign the interinstitutional agreement after 30 years working on it. We've been able to pay more attention to girls, boys, and teenagers. And we also need to create programs for the whole society. And we also need to involve men and boys. And we also need women's empowerment. Well, maybe I went too fast, too quick, but I really wanted to get to this final slide. What are we already doing? Well, of course, there's a lot to do, and we are working a lot. The laws don't change by themselves the situation. We need to develop them. We are not going to get that in 1 year. We've been working for 18 years, and I hope that this law will be healthy enough to continue progressing a lot. Well, of course, we've organized information sessions, which are very necessary to socialize the law, because the law needs to reach the public. We've been able to identify the content of the new mandates and the institutions involved in the implementation. We've started with some governing council agreements on criteria for the application of the law in public procurement, public subsidies, and strategic and sectoral plans. We've been able to finalize the consolidated text of the law approved by the last governing council, because we've modified three-fourths, of the law. So, and this has been passed by the last governing council. We've made the preliminary study for the creation of the Observatory for Equality between Women and Men, and this observatory needs to be fed from figures to give better guidelines to the politics. The third interinstitutional agreement for the improvement of care for women victims of male violence against women. It's been signed on the 19th of January, and this is a new field to work in. We are also in the 8th plan for the equality of women and men, and this is going to establish the guidelines for other Basque institutions. We are also working on the basis of the future Basque government equality training plan and for all the public officers, the public civil servants. The decree on aid to orphans and orphans of fatal victims of male violence, and the preliminary study for the implementation of financial aid for cases of non-payment of legally established compensation. We've also been working on the analysis of the development of Article 45.2 of Law for 205 on single-parent families and dissemination materials. We've been working a lot on these because we are also trying to promote the involvement of women in senior management. These are the challenges. Well, I think I went too fast, but I really wanted to share all this with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Miren Elgarresta. And we are at the end of this day. Today we have talked about the law that was adopted 1 year ago, and the regional councillor and Miren Elgarresta said that it's not the goal of laws and acts to be just on the paper, but their goal is to transform and improve our society. They do have an impact in our lives. Of course, they have an impact in equality policies as well. The aim is to have a society where men and women have the same rights. We have now time for a coffee break. We have prepared something outside the room, and we can keep talking if you want and have the time to stay. Thank you very much. We'd like to thank everyone for being here today. In the name of Emakunde, thanks to everyone who participated in this session. See you soon.